Hey there and welcome back to the Code Wrinkles channel for a brand new video. By the time we record this video right now, .NET 6 is about to come out in around 1 week from now. And if you haven't tried it out already, when you will do that, I can assure you that you will have a shock when it comes to the ASP.NET Core startup model, because it has totally changed. Now, conceptually, maybe the changes are not that big, but from a visual perspective or from our habits perspective, the change is very, very huge. So let me get right into it and show you exactly what I mean. So in ASP.NET Core, in .NET 6, no matter what project type you are choosing, if it is an API or an MVC application or Razor Pages, it really doesn't matter. You don't have the startup class anymore. So everything is handled here in this program.cs class. And if we take a look here, a little bit more careful, and if we also have worked maybe with other platforms like Express.js, we can see that actually what we have here is something very, very familiar to what we have in Express.js, because conceptually here in this program.cs class, which basically includes the entire startup behavior of your application, here we have everything that we need to configure our web application. Now, first of all, we just have here a web application builder. So on this builder, we can configure a couple of different things. And then, of course, when we have configured everything that we want, we just build the application so we receive back a web application. And then on the web application itself, we can perform some other actions like registering middleware and running the application, of course. Now, this means that we have conceptually two different steps that happen when you start up a new ASP.NET Core project on .NET 6. So once again, first of all, you have the web application builder on which you can configure a lot of different things. And you have then, after you have configured everything, you can then build the application. You get an instance of a web application back, and on the web application you can then register your middleware and finally run your application, and basically that's it. Now, of course, most probably you are very familiar and accustomed to use the startup class for configuring different parts of the applications, for instance, the services and the middleware pipeline. And the one thing that was very nice, for instance, in the startup class is that we had that iConfiguration object as a property, and we could use that, for instance, to read the environment or to get to get settings from our settings files and do a bunch of different other stuff. So everything right now has to happen then in this program.cs class, and of course this looks a little bit different than it used to on a more older or on .NET 5 or on ASP.NET Core 3.1. So let's, however, look right now how we can configure, for instance, our builder to add everything that we need to our application, and then what can we do once we build that application. Let's get started with the very first line here. Here we have, we have this web application and create builder. So we get back here a web application builder. Now on this builder instance, we have a lot of different options to configure different parts of our application. The first thing that I would like to actually go through is that here we see here that we have this args argument, which is a strings array. Now the idea is that theoretically, when you run this application via the command line, you can specify different type of arguments that would kind of like define, for instance, the environment on which it is running, the name of the application, and things similar to that. Of course, you could read this also from the configuration files, but yeah, this is how this actually usually happened. Now, if you don't want to pass arguments via the command line when you run the application, then what we can do here is simply we can provide here a new object of the type WebApplicationOptions. And here, if we have this web application options, for instance, we can configure the application name, which would be, let's say here, type of, let's here, why does it, okay, because we already had a T. So we want a type of, and we want to get type of our program class. And then of course we want to look into the assembly and then, well, get the name and display the name, probably. Then for instance, if we want to set our content root path, we can do this, and we can set this to our directory, get current directory. One very cool thing about Visual Studio 2022 is that you could actually write a lot of code just by using your tab key, which is fairly nice. Good. And then for instance, we can also specify the environment name. And here, this environment name should be equal to, we have here environment. We have also to type it correctly. And let's use just staging here. So yeah, that's it. Right now we have configured actually our web application builder options, and we have specified all these things that needs to actually be specified right at the beginning. And just to show that everything works and not to write a lot of stuff here, we have here a bunch of console write lines. As this application, like all the other ASP.NET Core applications, both in .NET 5 and ASP.NET Core 3.1, are essentially a console application that is configured to run as a web application and to handle requests, we can just simply also write things into the console. So if we run the application right now, it should start probably on the other screen. Will start also the Swagger documentation, but that's not something that we would need right now. So you see that here we have all these things that kind of we have configured or that we have passed in as web application options are now set on our builder, so we can read them and use them, for instance, if we have logic that actually depends on that. Now, the next very important thing to talk about here is reading and accessing configuration, because usually, as we did this in former .NET Core versions, like for instance .NET 5 or .NET Core 3.1, as said in the startup class, we had this iConfiguration property that we could use to access the configuration. Now, of course, since we don't have the startup class here anymore, of course, this all has gone away. So, of course, there needs to be a different way to handle that. And actually, that's very, very easy. Because if we look on our builder, and this is actually something that I really want to emphasize, we see that we have here different type of properties, and each property here is actually responsible to help us to configure our web application builder in a way that is meaningful for the application that we actually want to run. So we have here this configuration, and through this configuration property, we can do a bunch of stuff regarding the configuration. We have the services, which is essentially the iService collection, so where we can register services. We have here logging, for instance, where we can add logging providers, and that's a very important topic, and we'll look into that. Then we have, for instance, this host. And if we want to configure our IHost, then we can do that here by accessing this type of property. But then we can also access the environment, and we can also have access to the web host. And the IHost and the IWebHost are very, very important, because probably, I'm not sure if in all applications, but in a lot of cases, there were libraries, or you might have written your own code that kind of like extends the IHost behavior or the IWebHost behavior. And these extension methods should theoretically still work, so there shouldn't be any problems, as we will see just in a minute. However, the thing is that right now, if we want to execute or run these extension methods, we have to do that using the host or web host properties on the builder, or let's say, which is of course of type web application builder. So this is the only major difference. But let's start here, because we have started to talk about configuration. So we can have here, for instance, builder configuration, and here we can say, for instance, add JSON file. Now, what I have done for this setup here is I just have added a new JSON file, which is called settings.json, and here I have created actually two different properties here in this JSON object, a greeting and then a connection string object, which holds a property demo, which holds a certain string. Now this is maybe some other thing that is a little bit different than what we were used to, because for instance here by default in the app settings.json you don't have a connection strings properties. So when you start a new ASP.NET Core application on .NET 6, you would have to add yourself the configuration needed for your connection strings, and you can do that. You can do this, of course, in the app settings.json or the app settings and then environment.json. But you can do this also in your custom JSON file. So that's perfectly okay. No problem with that. Let's now go back to our program.cs class and say that we want to add our settings.json file to our configuration, which is actually okay. Now let me just use another code snippet here that I have prepared so that we don't waste a lot of time writing a bunch of console write lines. Here we have this variable greeting, and here on the configuration, once again, we get us the section that we desire, and in this case it's greeting, and then we get the value of it, which should be a string. And then for the connection string, you know that we had that extension method getConnectionString, which still works, is still here. The only thing is that you have to specify your connection strings property or JSON property by yourself. And then I have a demo connection string, and this is what we want to print in the console. So this is actually how we can access the configuration and read configuration. And of course, after we read this configuration, we could also use it in or implementing the IOptions pattern to read to plain POCO objects that represent options for our applications. But that's something that I really don't want to go into right now, because that works exactly the same as it worked also in previous versions of .NET Core. So here nothing has actually changed. So we have seen right now how we can access the configuration. In the absence of that iConfiguration property that we used to have, we can access that property actually directly on the builder, and there is where we can do actually our stuff. Of course, if we want to access the environment, once again on the builder we have this environment property, and for instance here we can access certain environment types. And for instance, this could be used, and that's a way that we used actually this type of information, for instance, to register certain services if we are in development, and registering maybe the same service interfaces but with other implementations if we are in production. So this is one scenario where you would actually want to read on which type of environment your application is currently running. So if we run the application right now, it should of course be staging, because we have set that staging, remember, in our web application options just when we created this new builder instance. So we have set this to staging, and therefore it displays staging in the console, which is actually okay. Now, another very important thing is, of course, logging. And for logging, once again, that's very, very easy, because on the builder, you have the logging. And here on the logging, for instance, you could add JSON console in this case. Of course, if we would install, for instance, Serilog or other logger providers like Log4net or Nlog, or what other type of logging providers you used in ASP.NET Core, you might need to run here or to execute different extension methods that are specific for each logger provider. But what I wanted to show here is that actually all these extension methods will work on this logging property that we have on the builder object. So this is how you will configure logging starting with .NET 6. And of course, some of the providers might have different other type of configuration, maybe adding something in the middleware, maybe also registering some services independently, but this is what you will find in the documentation of each logging provider. And right now, what's important for us to note is that once again, on the builder, we have this logging property, and we can use this logging property, as the name implies, of course, to configure our logging providers, which is very, very cool. Good. Now, the next thing that I want to touch here is how we can actually access extension methods on the IHost or on the WebHost, or set different configurations on the web host directly. So let me just use here another code snippet that I have prepared. So on the builder object, we have this host, which as you can see is this IHost builder. And here you can then configure host options, and you can specify or pass in any type of actions actually that that configure or that describe how you want your host to work. So in this case, we have configured this shutdown timeout to be of a value of 30 seconds, which means that when it is about to shut down, it will have a 30 seconds delay, time in which you can maybe dispose all other things that you want to dispose, or implement your logic that you actually want to implement or to run once the application is shutting down. So this is how you actually access this a host builder. Now, when it comes to the web host, this is actually, once again, we have this web host property, and here is, or what we do here, we add two different things on the web host. So first of all, we say that we want to use HTTP/sys, and this is very important because HTTP/sys runs only on Windows. So this means that if we do this configuration, it means that we can actually run our application only on IIS. So we cannot run it on Linux, which is very, very important. But if we have for our application some constraints that we have to use HTTP/sys instead, of the regular HTTP handling via Kestrel, then we can of course do that. And if we want to specify a different a web root path, which by default is that www root folder, we can also on the web host actually specify this via this use web root method, where we pass in the name of the folder that should serve as our web root path. Now, of course, we don't have such a folder right now, but I just wanted to show you exactly how this is done. Now, once we are through with all these type of configurations that you can have on the configuration, on the web application options, on the logging, on the environment, and then on the host and web host, last but not least, one other very, very important thing is that we can actually register our services here. So if we have here builder.services, and here we could say, for instance, add authentication, for instance, and that would add authentication services to our ASP.NET Core application. But this is actually where you would inject or configure or add all your services to the dependency injection container of .NET 6, just the same way that you did it also before. So here nothing has changed, only that once again we can add the services or register the services via this builder and not directly on the iServices collection, but on the builder we have these services, which is the iService collection, and here we can then add our services with add scoped or add transient or add singleton, both generic and non-generic. So here really nothing has changed. It works exactly the same way. The lifetimes are exactly the same as we had in previous versions of .NET. So nothing has really changed here. Now, once you have added your services, you can then go to the next step. And what happens here is that we build or we run this build method on the web application builder. And the result of that would be that we will get back an instance of a web application. And our instance of the web application will contain all the configurations that we have specified actually on this web application builder. So this is why we need to perform all these steps actually before we actually run the builder and create a new web application. But once we have a new web application, then we can do what we usually did in the configure method in our startup class. So what we did here was mostly, I say mostly, was done in the configure services method of the startup class. But then what comes after this builder.build is actually what we have previously done in the configure class in the startup class of ASP.NET Core. And that's essentially one thing, just registering middleware. And that's exactly what we are doing here. These are the same type of middleware that are generally used in all web API templates that you have also in previous versions of .NET. So here nothing has changed. And if you want to use your own, for instance, you can register your own custom middleware. Once again, I don't want to go into custom middleware right now. If you want to take a look, we have a bunch of videos here on this channel that talk a lot about what middleware is, how middleware works, how we can create our custom middleware classes, and so on. And I will leave a link to those videos in the description of this video. And of course, there are some cards here on the screen somewhere. You might click on them directly. Now, what we could, for instance, do here in app, we can say here app.use course. That would add cross-origin resource sharing to our middleware pipeline. But once again, here we could add our custom middleware, just we were accustomed to do in previous versions of .NET. So nothing has actually changed here. And then after we add all our middleware, we have this map controllers, which actually binds to the controllers that we have. And then we run the application. And after this last line of code executes, this is actually the point where we have a running application. So if we run it again, we see that it will open up a console. And right now, when we see all the logging things, okay, now we have everything here. So now the application is working. Now we have added this JSON logging, and this is why we get this type of logging right now, because we have added JSON console logging as a logging provider previously. So this is why the output of logging has changed in our console. But that's actually it. So let's try to make a very, very short summary about that. So first of all, the major difference between .NET 6 and previous versions of .NET when it comes to ASP.NET Core is that we don't have the startup class anymore. Everything, all the magic, happens in the program.cs class, which is and also was the startup class, kind of like also in previous versions of .NET. But right now, everything that we need to do to configure our application will be done here in this program class. So no startup needed. And then if we look at this program class, we can actually divide it into two different parts, I would say. So it would be the part, the first one where we configure our web host builder, we add our services, we read our configurations, we add our configurations if we have custom configuration files that we want to use. Then we can read the environment, we can set the environment, we can set new logging providers, for instance, we can of course add our services. And last but not least, of course, we can then run extension methods or configure our host respectively our web host with the settings that we actually need. And once we have done this, then there is this second portion, I would say, of this program class or of the startup behavior of a .NET 6 ASP.NET Core application, which happens after we actually use that builder and call this build method on the builder, which will result in an instance of a web application. So now we have a fully configured web application to which we can simply add our middleware, and then we can run it, and that's it. We are good to go. So that's kind of it when it comes to the new startup behavior of ASP.NET Core in the new .NET 6. There are some things that are fairly new, and probably the very first time you would open a new ASP.NET Core project in .NET 6, you will be a little bit shocked, and it will be maybe a little bit not difficult, but well, new, actually new. I guess new is the best word here when it comes to how to configure your application. But in the end, I think that the result is, from my point of view, very nice, because we have everything in one single file. And of course, there is one problem with this, but that problem was also there with the regular startup class that we had in previous versions, that this program.cs class will get crowded with a lot of code when we develop real applications, because we have probably to add a lot of different services, different configurations, and also probably some bunch of custom middleware classes. And this file will probably or eventually get very, very, very long. So in this case, of course, we have techniques to kind of refactor the code, maybe to use extension methods to do all this type of stuff. And if you want to take a look into some possible techniques for solving these problems, we have done here on this channel some live coding sessions on creating a .NET 6 minimal API from scratch. And if you look there in the part 1, so in the very, very first session that we did, then we have actually refactored our program.cs class, and we have extracted all the different parts of it in a different type of extension methods. So you might want to go there and take a look for a deeper look into how you might want to refactor your program.cs class so that it so that you can keep it as clean as possible. And that's it for this video, I guess. Thank you very, very much for watching. And if you find this content useful, don't be shy and hit the thumbs up button. Subscribe, of course, if you haven't done this already. And if you want to say something, because this is a very new thing, I would say, a totally new thing here in ASP.NET Core in .NET 6. And if you have questions regarding this, don't be shy. Once again, and use the comment section. I am more than happy to get the comments going and get into a discussion with you there. And of course, if you think you might have friends or colleagues that might find this video interesting, then share it with them. Sharing is caring. Spread the word, because this is how everybody can get to the information that they need, and they probably don't know that it is out there somewhere. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.